Hi, this is a case study for a friend of mine whose name is John Maluso, who's present in the room. And I'd like to introduce some of the newer uses of the Rayid model and how it is being completely altered again in a far more useful way for anyone to be able to understand the dynamics of self in a relationship to the family and the family tree. So this is a, part educational, part case study, part dialogue, where John may be asking me questions and occasionally he'll come on camera or not. And this is just going to give you a way of being able to see the way I'm currently looking at it. What I've drawn here is an inverted pyramid. This inverted pyramid is a pyramid that has 15 primary points on it. These 15 primary points, they are associated with self, which is John's eyes here, and it also corresponds to his father and his mother, and that represents 3. Then it also includes John's 12 ancestral influences, or the grandparents, great-grandparents and grandparents, that now makes a total of 15. That number 15 is important for lots of different reasons, but this is also what I'm calling the dashboard of the soul, because each one of these 15 points has a series of remarkable gifts and opportunities, and each one of these 15 points, they also contribute to the epigenetic influences that are affecting his well-being, health, happiness, and so on. So what we do in this is we correspond the structure of the eye as an initial way of understanding the natural endowment of John's soul at the point of incarnation, and how the iris is primarily constructed under 3 months of gestation. And during those 3 months, there are 3 primary layers, each laid down in sequence, that corresponds to the 3 layers of the iris from the deepest to the most superficial. So the first month being primarily the deepest layer. If you look in any one of these positions in the eye, you see very deep vascular or fiber arrangements, fascia in the iris, and then you'll see a series of layers coming forward. Each one of these 3 corresponds with a wide variety of different experiences and the topography of the iris. So this ends up becoming the constitutional framework. That constitutional framework is related to the experience of being able to recognize the attributes that the soul incarnated with, that was unobstructed by the dynamics of the family tree, because at the point of conception, the ancestral influences are infused into the natural attributes. Then there comes very quickly the mother and the father's emotional contributions, and by that their individual relationships with each other and their parents now begin to lay down another layer of influences. Over a period of time, these influences accumulate and they produce a series of social or emotional symptoms. And we're going to discuss the wide variety of these, but I'm going to introduce some of the more important parts of this overall introduction about how it works. Just so you know, I've included these 2 irises that are not related to John's family, and I wanted to show the dynamic differences between what you would call the masculine contributions and the feminine contributions, which may be quite different than what people are familiar with. For example, I have the individual, or if you will, jewel type patterns on the mother's side, because most of the contributions from the mother's side, they have to do with the experience of myself. And the contributions from the father's side have a lot to do with my relationships to other people and how I express my creativity and my emotions and how I bond or don't bond, and how my success in the world is about relating to other people. So the dynamic function from the father's side, it's relating to other people and bigger systems, like global systems, educational systems, ecological systems, political, social, religious systems. Whereas the mother side really has a lot more to do with an accumulation about how I feel about myself in gradually increasing diameters, which means how do I feel about myself in a social network? How do I feel about myself in other networks of creation such as ecological, environmental? How do I feel about myself rather than the system as a whole? So I'll describe those much more thoroughly as we get into it. Then we're going to describe why this part of it is so utterly important. Because this bottom part of this entire framework has to be the willingness of the person to be able to identify their own individual self. Now this is the self that occurs before there is an actual willingness to examine the mother's contribution and the father's contribution. I need to be able to have the willingness to do this. Now what I've learned about the individual parts of this component, all 15 of these are universal attributes of all souls, and they wait to be awakened or realized, and they are only realized when I choose to have a sincere desire to know the truth about. What I mean by that is the sincere desire to know the truth about myself, the sincere desire to know the truth about my relationship to my mother, my father, which also corresponds to the divine feminine, the divine masculine, the sincere desire to know these individual attributes. So then we'll go into the significance of why it is so very important that people recognize the opportunity to know themselves by recognizing and feeling how the soul was actually entering into the material or spiritual body, and how there is an ultimate crosswalk inside the human being where the greatest opportunity to access one's personal soul, or the experience of one's feelings, or the clarity of one's ability to seek, and so on. There is a place that can only be accessed by the desire to do so. So I'm going to take this basic overall thumbnail of these different positions and then correspond that to John, because John has a series of physiological symptoms that have accumulated over decades. Like most people, they oftentimes believe in their 20s that they're immortal and never will have a problem, and then they start to go through the 30s, and that's the professional era of always being correct, and sometimes there's a certain dynamics in the 30s that's very different than the 20s. There's another dynamics in the 40s that's very different than the 30s, and so on. Now John is 65, and there is an accumulation of symptoms that are troubling his well-being and physical body. He has irritations in the lower spine. He has irritations that have an accumulation of things in his lungs, and he also has a nerve pinched in his neck. And we're going to take these symptoms and correspond them to the specific locations in the family, because each part of the family tree has a different gland and organ and body system. And if we can locate the specific combination of symptoms and their corresponding location in the family tree, we can seek the truth about the feelings in that location, and then from the desire to know the feelings there and to ask for the appropriate level of feeling or help about that place, the goal is to bring about a gradual or complete resolution of the symptoms and return back to the opportunity for the greater wellspring of health. That is the overall use. The nature of the Rayid as it exists now is really changing into looking at the individual positions of the eyes in a completely different way. For example, this is John's right eye. This right eye is commonly of the left brain or the masculine. The newer way to look at this is the lateral or outside half of the right eye has to do with the father's feelings about his own father's family, how his father treated the masculine. The medial position of the right eye is how the mother treated the masculine. Now that is a very important shift in how we observe now the structure of the eye as well as the positions. So for example, the patterns in the lower medial part of the masculine eye comes from the mother's relationship to the masculine, which usually corresponds to her father and can also be the transmission of her own father's relationship to his family. So by looking at the lower medial part of the eye, we're also looking at the first rung on the ladder. If you can think of the spine like a ladder, that very first rung has to do with number 1. So the first place we'll look here at mother's father's line, that'll ultimately correspond to many things related to the breath, many things related to enthusiasm, imagination, creativity, and how the relationship of the mother's father's family affects everything from the respiratory function, the metabolic systems, how it affects the skin and the pineal, the sleep cycle, asthma, panic, terror, and a whole bunch of other things. But to understand this sequence of this position being how the mother created men in her life that gave her the opportunity to experience her own attitudes epigenetically about her father's relationship. She attracts a relationship to her husband, which is a relationship here, which had its own form of dynamics. When you see this pattern in here, and you get the history of the mother's relationship to her father, you find out that there is a difficulty between the mother and the father, which now corresponds to a difficulty in the relationship to the husband that she attracts. You look at the pattern of symmetry and what happens now in the opposite eye. In the feminine eye, you look at the lower quadrant in here, and not as significant as that one, but you find out that there is a symmetrical relationship of the father in relationship to his mother, which is a very common principle in the symmetry of how the family tree works. So each one of these positions has a corresponding likely symptom. So in John's case, he has some development of respiratory difficulties, the gradual dry cough, some calcium deposits in his lungs, he has a pinched nerve in his neck, and we began to identify how each location of the family tree also has a number on this ladder. So the things at the bottom, number 1, that's mother's relationship to her father and father's relationship to his mother. That's the primary contribution to the bottom of this ladder. So I'm going to stay, for the purpose of being able to be within a reasonable period of time, mostly into discussing why number 1 is so important. It is far more important than we've ever actually given it credit for. What I mean by that is the individualization of John's incarnation into the spiritual and material body gave him the opportunity to become aware of the distinction and the individuality of his own soul. So the importance of this interior self. So the examination of this interior self has a lot to do with who am I? What am I? What am I capable of doing? What is my natural ability? What is my natural passion? What can I do to know and feel myself? This is the development of the desire to know self before there is the examination to mother and father, divine feminine, divine masculine, and all of the other 14 parts of the dashboard. The essential one is, how do I feel about myself? That's why this is so important. So we're going to talk very briefly, this is not designed to be detailed on any part, just an overview about why this knowledge of self is important. How do we begin the process of knowing self? Part of that is a willingness to look around and go, well, I exist. That's important. I'm here. I do feel like I have the right to move my arm, move my other arm or leg. I have some degree of free will. So there requires just a small leap of faith to recognize that I have the choice to be in the world by the acceptance of the responsibility that I can make choices. And perhaps one of the most distinctive choices to make first is to build the sincere and genuine desire to know myself. Now, why is that so important? It's one thing to have the intention to want to know myself. It's another thing to have the desire. Some people don't like this word called desire, but it's really about a yearning or a longing or a hunger to know what I am. You can call that self or higher self or lower self or overlord or the thousands other names that theological or philosophical processes call it. You can call it spirit. I have a tendency to call it soul, but before we even go to the possibility of the existence of a soul that has a creator, I can't go there without the initial willingness to want to build the desire to know the truth about myself. Now that sounds like an easy thing, but in reality it's not that easy, because oftentimes the desire to know oneself is oftentimes predicated on the avoidance of or the attraction to a fear or a facade in some way or another. So how do I know myself without fear and without facade? How do I come into only what is me? Now, one of the ways that I've been experimenting with, and I'm eventually going to detail this, is I've been examining the formation of the iris in that first 3 months of gestation. Part of the process of examining that time period has to do with the recognition that is the very first moment that my soul comes into incarnation. But during that first 3 months of gestation, there are no senses that are currently activated, and there are no thoughts or the capacity to make thoughts. There is no mind engaged. Now, why that's important is that after 3 months, the gradual infusion of the senses becomes more dominant. So my sense of hearing, my sense of eyesight, taste and touch and smell, they now are layered down on top of that, all of the senses related to some form of fear. So I look, I hear, I watch, I taste, I have textures, I touch, and they're all related to how to sense my external phenomena, and generally I come back with some kind of reactive impulse that makes me attracted to the person or situation, or repelled by that person or situation, all based on how to feed my facade addiction or my fear. None of that related to the experience of how to experience or feel my own soul. So my invitation for any of you, and it's a thing I'm also beginning to explore and will continue to do so, is how to feel the soul without thought, without words, without any form of sensation. Because all of the senses are related to polarity-oriented oscillation, wavelength, frequencies of taste, color, sound, sensation. All of the vibratory influences of action, agitation, all of these are based on sensory experiences. How do I experience my own soul without engaging any sensory-oriented phenomena that's linked to a fear. That's a very significant thing to do. So I can't close my eyes because it's not about eyesight. I can't put on music. I can't go to my pharmacological experiences of taste. I can't use drug influences. I can't use alcohol or sex or anything else, or music. I can't use anything in the sensory realm to actually have the experience of my own soul. That is the primary foundation of learning to actually occupy, because I have the desire to do so. I build inside of me a stronger magnetic attraction. I produce a stronger and stronger desire. Only by the free will operation of my desire to know myself can this increase. Because this element of knowing myself cannot increase without the exercise of my own free will. So the exercise of my free will to know the truth about my own soul sets up now a greater opportunity to know my relationship to my parents on both sides. Now I can increase my capacity from that perspective to know the individuality of who I am without the acquired damage, either directly from the mother or the father, or without the acquired damage from the epigenetic influence of the ancestors. So who am I if I don't have the damage of my mother and my father and my family tree? But interesting enough, one of the only ways that I know of so far to resolve that is to accept the responsibility to feel it, and through the experience of feeling it, to know the truth about it. Now, one of the ways to increase the capacity to know the truth is to look at the symptoms. So each part of the divine masculine, each part of the divine feminine corresponds to a gland, an organ, and a body system that many of you are already aware of. So when a gland or an organ or a body system is having a symptom, it helps us look at the different parts of the family tree and how they may be influencing the current condition. Just so you know, and we're not going to go there today, each one of these is a direct involvement in the spiritual body that's often associated with how that particular ancestor actually is currently locked into the spiritual body. Now that may sound a little bit scary to some people. Just when you thought it's okay that your mother or your mother's father passed away, they're no longer around, oftentimes that grandfather or great-grandfather is actually engaged in the spirit body currently, and they're attached to, or they're an earthbound soul, and they're continually interfering in the dynamics of this person's capacity to be able to increase their own ability to know their own soul. So how do we lovingly deal with spirit attachments into the spiritual body that prevent us from the increase of having happiness? So the Rayid work is gradually moving toward the recognition of these 14 different places in our family tree, and how they're often linked not only in a genetic way, but they're linked in an energetic way into the spiritual body and obstructing a body system, gland, or organ or chakra if you prefer. This is the nature of how the work is, an overview of what's coming. Because each one of these individual positions, they will relate to different parts of the family tree. To give you an understanding, we already referred to how the inside medial part is the mother's-father's relationship. The outside lateral part is the father's relationship. In the same way that the lateral part of the left eye is how the mother felt about her mother. Now we're talking about parents and grandparents. This is why maybe 85 to 90% of all of the marks in the iris are in the bottom half of the eye. Because the bottom half of the eye relates to mother and father and their parents. And this is the most direct influence affecting this grandchild. Now, when those grandparents have particular attitudes about something else, they can also affect other parts of the eye, but for now, the majority of the places we're going to look at are in the bottom half of the eye. The reason for that? First rung of the ladder. When you start to look at the lateral part of the eye, you're looking at the second rung of the ladder. When you start to look at the 9 o'clock or 8 and 9 o'clock on the lateral side, when you start to looking at the middle, you're going to be looking at something called number 3 and 4. You look at the top, you're going to be looking at 5 and 6. So there's going to be primarily 1 through 6 from the mother and father side that are directly related to the sequences of glands and organs vertically in the body. From the pituitary and the pineal at the top to the thyroid, parathyroid, all the way down to the middle of the body, you're going to have a ladder. So as we examine these individual places, it's going to give us the opportunity to want to know the truth about these individual locations, and because of the desire to know the truth, this gives a higher level of reality or spirit or the divine the opportunity, because of our sincere desire, to actually give us the things that we're seeking. Or we can do it without upper divine help by beginning to learn how to be able to control it ourselves. These are choices we can make, to do it alone or to do it with help. This is an overview of what's coming next about the general structure of the eye, and there's so much more that we can talk about. I'm excited about how this is going to change the knowledge about the positions. This is going to change the functions of how this works, and how the individual areas are so incredibly important. And I know it's a simple thing, but it's very, very important to recognize that these 15 different places within us, starting with ourselves, our parents and our grandparents, they are attributes universal to all souls, but we have to choose to open them. For example, compassion, as many of you have known before, compassion is a unique quality that primarily emanates through the father's side of the family. So the father's mother and the father's mother's mother, they relate to the immune system function, about how the immune system touches the entire body. Later, that sensitivity that involves empathy, the magnitude or the diameter of that empathy now becomes our feelings about ecological systems. So our empathy or our compassion now extends out in broader diameters until we have gradually a compassion for all living things, including the ecological systems by which they exist, until eventually our compassion for all living things affects us. So we can choose to have compassion and respect for ecological order and diversity, or we can choose not to have that because it's a free will choice. But if I'm presented with the opportunities to have compassion for other people or other systems or ecological order, and I choose to have the compassion, now that attribute begins to open. Over a period of time, the greater my desire to increase the compassion actually accelerates that part of the dashboard of the soul. Then eventually that sensitivity increases my sensitivity to all living things, including the 5 different species on Earth, birds, insects, reptiles, fish, mammals, and so on, that I have now a sensitivity to all things. Why is that so important? For 1,000 or more different reasons, that eventually I can become aware of 2 places simultaneously on the Earth, or I can actually be 2 places in the spirit world at once, or I can use the experience of what I acquire through this empathy to be able to travel, well, quite quickly in the spirit world, and on and on and on. So each one of the places in these 15 locations, they have to do with specific attributes I can choose with my free will to activate. All of this is founded on my first choice to know the truth about my own soul. So we'll talk about the dynamics about how this works, because there are two primary forces that open up all of these gates. One is a constrictive force, the other is a dilating force. Down here, the dilating force is my sincere desire to feel and to release anything that is damaging to myself. So I need to be willing to examine any belief system I have about myself, known or unknown to me. Because if I'm holding a damaging belief system about myself and I don't know it, I'm going to end up having a social or physical symptom of some kind. Thanks for coming by. That was timely enough.
It was timely, and one, I want to briefly interject something, if I may. And I want to acknowledge for the audience, and also acknowledge you, Denny, that the evaluation not only of the iris patterns, but the integration into the birth order is quite remarkable. And specifically for me, I can talk about the specific, shall I say, challenges on both sides for me. The challenge that my dad had, which was a big disconnect for him.
Now wait, this is your father, and you're saying your father, just back up a little bit so they can, you're still on. This is your father, and we didn't have room for your father's father, we just put up your father's mother for now.
Yeah, but the break with my father's mother was he was always told that he was worthless. And that, because he had different ideas and she was very traditional. And so he never told me that I was worthless, but he gave me a pattern that set something up, and I'll just use your figures. I was always coming outside of myself to create, shall I say, a creation to prove my worth.
Okay.
To this side.
All right.
So it was all about proving and not necessarily being myself, but proving some worthiness, if you will.
Okay.
On the other side,
now this is your mother.
Right.
This is your mother's father.
Right, and she definitely had challenges with her dad and challenges with her mom that showed up primarily from what I would say anger. And even though myself, I did not contribute to my awareness to her anger, I was a boy. I was a male. And so I was always doing whatever I could to create a, shall I say, an image of myself that was deserving of forgiveness and not stimulating anger, to be kind.
No, wait, did you use the kindness to avoid the mother's anger?
Absolutely, absolutely. So it wasn't necessarily that my behavior was exactly what I should be doing. I was trying to avoid mom's anger.
Now most people either become aggressive or passive about it, so you're avoiding mother's anger, which was really in her relationship to her own father and her relationship to your father, that's now reflected down to you, because you being that gender, she now, without even knowing it, transmits that feeling to you. Then you carry that dynamic around in your relationship to women.
Exactly, exactly. And so what I really understood based on the diagram, it's very, very important for me not to create some image of myself that is worthy, or not create some image of myself that is undeserving of anger. It's important for me to be me, where my, shall I say, identity and the creations that I do and the actions, I am sure that there are some behaviors that I might have that could stimulate somebody's anger, stepping on their toes.
No doubt. Then the...
But the idea is the conflict between trying to avoid anger and trying to create worth is tearing me apart.
Sure. Now, part of the challenge of this is to desire to know the truth about self, and then to desire to know the truth about the relationship to the mother and the father, because that sincere desire now can be mirrored into their relationship. And why is it so important to know these different relationships? Is because now they are contributory to the symptoms that are affecting your health, well-being, or mobility. So the long-term way of doing this is to look at the symptoms that you're creating and to become aware of what's here, because you're carrying, if there is a specific difficulty that she has here with her father, you're carrying something inside you that mirrors that. If there is an issue with your father and his mother, and he has a particular difficulty that is symmetrical to his wife's or your mother's, then you have another one. Now, we have virtually dozens of these, if not hundreds of these, what you might call rocks of unloving behavior inside ourselves.
Well, and see, that concept, what I would say is in my, shall I say, masculine projection out into the world,
Yes.
and my feminine area in my world, that intuitive place, if I am in my behaviors reflecting this whole line, and those two are definitely, shall I say, diametrically opposed in myself, these little behaviors are demonstrated here that demonstrates this whole line. And that's what I was sort of becoming aware of.
You're, by the willingness to objectively look at your own self, utilizing the iris, and to add to that the experience of what you know about your mother and your father, and what history you've gathered from the family tree. This is a sincere desire to know the truth about yourself and the relationship to the family tree, which gives you the opportunity to come from a place of truth about your current condition. And so look, I have these symptoms, I get it, I have these different things happening inside of me. Now I want to be able to resolve this because I want to feel what these damaging parts of me that were given to me. I want to be able to go through the process of the forgiveness of mother and father, and even the places that they come from, that by feeling it, I can actually begin to resolve it.
Well, and I think that's some of the key lessons for me, in particular, is the behaviors that I do with Mom to avoid anger are probably wise behaviors. But if the motivation is different than essentially expressing who I am, if I am doing a behavior to avoid anger, that same behavior might be this. If I'm doing a motivation of a behavior to create something that I am proud of to essentially get approval from this side, it still might be the same behavior, but the more that it's separated, the more that I'm motivated because I'm trying to get approval or avoid anger, that creates a schism for me.
Yes, that schism is what affects the body well-being and health. But any time that we're doing anything to avoid somebody else's control or projection using anger, and we do something to please, we're actually betraying our own soul and betraying them by not responding with truth. Anytime we produce an outer self-image to try and gain respect or greater attention from somebody else, we're betraying our own self or the other people by producing a facade. So the goal is to come down here and to increase the capacity to be aware of self and not engage in this avoidance or not engage in this projection, both of which are damaging and causing the schism. So it's how to be able to feel this. So the primary purpose of this introduction is to give people the opportunity to at least get an overview of where we're going with the new information using a currently live subject, right? To be able to,
I am alive. I
right?
resemble that remark.
And this is where the work's going, about how this works, and then eventually to understand the difference between the self-image functions generated by the mother side and the social dynamics generated by the father side, how we relate to the external, how we relate to the internal, to the metabolic systems and the body cleansing systems, how we relate to the immune system, how we relate to the motion systems.
I think one thing that would be helpful for me, and probably the audience, how is it that the masculine function, or the derivation of external and internal of these two lines, if you will, that would be helpful to expand on, I think, for me.
So eventually what we're going to get into are these lines. We're going to get into the line that relates to your mother's relationship to her father, and we're going to get into the lines that represent the relationship of your mother to her mother. These produce two different forces in the body called ascending or descending forces, and they relate to different body systems. There's one that's related to the ascending, and that regulates all the body chemistry and the metabolic system and really the energy systems of the body. The other one relates to the urinary, bladder, kidney, bowels, skin. This is the cleaning mechanism of the body. These are primarily contributed from the mother's side of the family. On the opposite side of the family, we're going to get the two different forces on the father's side. These are called the ascending and descending forces of the masculine. One of them having to do with the ascending masculine, which is everything to do with motion or action or creation. This has everything to do with the fire of digestion, the fire of the blood, fire of the heart, and the fire to proceed into the world with an action. All forms of movement are regulated by that one line. The other line is the line of what's called the descending masculine. That has to do with the immune system, the digestion, the liver, the assimilation, the mineral functions at the bottom of the body, neural fascia, and everything related to the ability to hold the body together and regenerate.
So in the dualistic model here, as you increase one, it's very important to increase the other. For example, it's sort of like the wheels of a car. If you start going faster in the car, in the external world, it's important to have your wheels aligned. Would you say that?
Yes,
good?
that's correct. And it's like each one of these places is linked to the family tree. But all of these links come down to, first, how do I feel about myself? And there is a very significant part about how I feel about myself in an interior way that is contributed by the mother. So the mother's influence is primarily more interior, whereas the father's function is primarily more exterior. It has to do with movement and actions and achievement and social belonging or outer prosperity or success. So later we can define them more clearly, but these attributes of these are primarily 12, combined with the mother and father to make 14, combined with the first one, self, to make 15. Eventually, the knowledge of this leads to important things.
So, if mom doesn't have a lot of self-esteem and doesn't, feel good about herself, and that was contributed by her parents and her grandparents,
yes,
then it would be natural that shall I say, that inner value might be contributed down to here.
And shows up in the structure of the eye about who it was that contributed that.
I see.
That's why the structure can be so important, because every one of these positions will tell you about what part of the family tree contributed this number 6 position versus a number 4 versus a 3 versus a number 2. So those will all be related to different ancestral chains. Now this is just a thumbnail overview of the changes that's going into Rayid in the moment. So this is, thank you for the opportunity to be willing to put your family up here. This is designed to give people a little bit of a glimpse of what's coming in the future.
Well, I think one of the things also that, because I know that you're, shall I say, integrating with the principles of epigenetics, you know, since the DNA is the, shall I say, the building blocks or the tie that brings all of these together, that in fact, what's fascinating to me is that this little spot might be a time bomb on the epigenetic DNA chain that, with the proper conditions, opens up new possibilities for either growth or death. Because undoubtedly that's what we're going to either heal or die, and the opportunity to heal or die that particular spot, that particular genetic pattern, that memory, that time bomb, if you will, is a big part of what I see you contributing to the world.
Thanks, John. The influences in all these places give us a remarkable opportunity to accept the responsibility for what they mean to us, because sooner or later, every one of these places inside me, I will deal with. I'll either deal with it now because I have the desire to deal with it, or sooner or later in the spirit world, I'm going to be faced with having to resolve every one of these marks in myself, and all of the damage contributed by my own free will, and all the damage created by the free will of my mother and my father, and all the others will be there.
Well, and I think it's very, very important to realize that all of us can contribute to the healing, or you know, the either the denial or the projection, and even go into self-medication. A lot of people drink away their problems, or you know, have infidelity in their relationships, which contributes to more anger. Those patterns are going to be exacerbated or minimized depending on the actions of everyone.
That's correct. So there's lots of different ways to deal with this, and the opportunity to understand the dynamics of how the self in relationship to mother and father and the family tree, for us to be able to apply this information on ourselves first. So I'm going to be introducing a series of experiments, and I call it that because I'm going to ask people to experiment with each phase of it before we go on to the next phase. That is an opportunity to exercise a free will to choose to be involved or not. So
something that, you know, just for application standpoint, one of the things that I find extremely fascinating is, let's say a parent comes in and they have these two eyes, and the child has this eye. You can honestly tell them the issues that not only the child will experience in the future, but how the parents can help resolve and make their child way a little easier in their life. I mean, it's the idea of saying, wow, all we have to do is be conscious about who this person is, and I do that by knowing who I am and healing that, and the same with mom.
that's correct, John. Have a seat. Part of the process is, yes, we can look at the irises of very young children and look at the epigenetic influence and give the guardians of the parents the opportunity to look at their contribution to the child. While the child is still completely receptive, we can look at how to be able to assist the parents in resolving their own family dynamics, so there is no necessity for this damage in the iris to be infused in the child and show up 50 or 60 years later. So for now, this is where we've gone with this, and I hope that this basic introduction has been a useful thing for the audience, and I appreciate John coming by to be a living guinea pig of this work. John has been involved in this work for, well, going on 35 years or something like that. He was there with some of the very first information that the IRIS came out with in 1978 or 79, and has followed this work for a number of years and also is engaged in presenting it at times. So stick around, we'll come back and give you another view, because we're going to have a series of these starting with how to understand it at a very basic level in a series of building blocks. Thanks for coming by.